Ocean's Bride. Book 3 in the Siren of War series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Your tea is ready, Tuan. I blinked and the shadowy figure in the doorway departed, the sound of her footsteps fading. William's arm tightened around my breasts as he pressed harder into my back. He sighed. If only I didn't have to work today, I could stay in bed with you all day, lass. Maybe this was the heaven Mary's church priest had spoken about. The sheer joy of waking up beside the man I loved, and knowing how much he loved me in return. Maybe not too, for simply lying beside him reminded me of what we'd done last night, and what I ardently desired to do again. It's not day yet, I responded. The sun hasn't risen, so it's still our wedding night. He chuckled and the bed creaked as he sat up. My day starts before dawn, lass. I need to find out what news the wireless station received while we were busy in bed. We're still busy in bed, I insisted, reaching for him. William caught my hand in his and lifted it to his lips for a kiss. A good wife obeys her husband and a good husband earns his keep, so he can support a lovely wife like you. Tonight, lass. He rose. A good wife. A good human wife. How could I ever manage to be that? I'd spent my childhood learning to lead mermaids and seduce humans. That made me a good lover certainly, but a good wife? I'd never spent more than a night with the man I loved. Giuseppe had died the next day and William had. The last time we shared a bed, you rejected me in the light of dawn, William. That night the ship sank and it was too late. I'm afraid. I heard the weakness in my voice and stopped speaking. The ocean would not take him from me again. William gathered me in his arms. If I'd known what would happen, I'd never have left. I was angry at myself for giving in to my desires, for taking advantage of a girl I'd sworn to protect. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. You don't know how sorry I am. I pulled him onto the bed beside me and settled firmly in his lap. Then make amends, William. Now. He stroked my hair. If I can, I will. What can I give you, lass? My heartfelt apologies, a promise to never take advantage of you again, a vow to protect you always. I'd give you anything for you to forgive me for what I did to you that night. I laughed gently. It's not the night I regret, but the morning. All I want from you is what I wanted then. Name it, lass, and it's yours. I shifted in his lap so I straddled him as I had his triumph last night. Ah, but he was hotter and harder than the leather saddle as he slid smoothly inside me. I want to take you for another ride, William, first sighed, tilting my hips to take him in deeper. 2. I sponged perspiration from my skin with the tepid water in the wash basin, wishing I could go for a swim instead, until William's reflection in the mirror diverted my attention. He kissed my damp neck, smiled at me and whispered that he'd be back for breakfast as soon as he could. You'd better get dressed first though, he called cheerfully over his shoulder as he left. Sighing, I rummaged through my trunk for a light summer dress. I left off my stockings and shoes, choosing to pad barefoot along the floorboards to the kitchen. Idly, I wondered what sort of jam they had for my toast in a tropical climate like this one. The kitchen didn't smell of yeast, like Mary's had on baking days, but that didn't deter me. William's cook had made tea for him, so perhaps yesterday had been for baking and the bread was stored somewhere. All I had to do was find it. A large pan stood on the stove, and curiosity drove me to lift the lid. I almost squealed in delight at the sight of nasi goreng kampung, a fried rice dish I hadn't seen or smelled since I left Coco's. I hunted through the cupboards for a bowl and a spoon. The first piled-high spoonful set me to coughing, as I'd grown unused to the strong spices while living with Mary and her mild cooking, but the flavor of home was irresistible. I dug my spoon in again. "Nu mem nu," a woman's voice shouted. Shocked, I found myself on one side of a tug-of-war for my bowl of rice. One of the serving women from last night had grabbed it almost out of my hands, and it was all I could do to keep my breakfast from tipping out. "Men's dinner." "Not for you," she scolded, slamming the lid down on the pan's contents. I released my grip on the bowl, finally understanding. "You mean this is not for William and First?" "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "Here, let me help you make some more." I hurried to the cupboard where I'd found the uncooked rice earlier. I had no idea how to cook the stuff, but I'd learned from Mary that most cooking was along the same lines: follow the standard instructions and then flavor to taste. I grabbed a mixing bowl and dropped to my knees. "No ma'am." She slammed the cupboard door, narrowly missing my fingers. "Breakfast at 8. Tuan's orders." She waved her hand at the basket of eggs on the table. "Not your place, ma'am. Your tea is in the dining room." No, not my place, I reflected and retreated to the dining room. The taste of chili still burned my tongue, so I poured a cup of tea from the tea service on the sideboard. Steam from the muddy brew wafted up, and I knew I couldn't bear to drink it. I searched the room for an alternative, but there wasn't even a jug of water this morning. "William and his muddy mine tea that no sane person would drink," I sighed, taking my cup back to the kitchen. I set it carefully on the counter and announced, "This is not my tea. This is for William." She stared at the cup, then me in consternation. "I will make more, ma'am." "Maria." "My name is Maria." "Please, what is your name?" I asked. "Cook." "I am Cook." I shook my head. "Not your job. Your name. It feels so impersonal to call you by anything else." "Impersonal is good. Name is for family. In this house I am Cook." She nodded at the other woman I recognized from last night. Her hair was still pulled into a tight bun. "This is Amar. She will take care of your children." She eyed my midsection. "Give Tuan strong sons." Sons? I wanted to laugh. Boys were so rare among our kind that I'd never known one to bear a son. Human fathers couldn't sire sons with the people of the ocean's gift. No, the father had to be one of our own kind, a dragon as my grandfather had been. But if bearing children was what good human wives did, then I could at least give him daughters. Perhaps humans were not so different to my kind. Cook, if indeed she insisted that I call her that, seized a tin I recognized as the English-style tea that William and Mary drank. Surely there was something better in the house. Chinese women didn't drink the foul English brew. "Do you have any other tea?" I asked. "That stuff tastes horrible. In Coco's and in Australia I didn't drink this." Cook stared at me again. "Coco's? You are a Ross?" She knew Coco's, for she'd named the family that ruled the islands. I needed to tread carefully. "No. My father was Wood Jones. A cable man. A cable man who'd married one of the Ross girls after I was born," I thought but didn't say. She nodded slowly. "My brother's family lives on Coco's. Working hard for your family, as I do for Tuan here. I will cook Malay food for you, ma'am, if you wish. But Tuan, not for Tuan. He orders food from his faraway home." I managed a smile. I'd forgotten William's inexplicable taste for flavorless food. "What I want is tea. Real tea without milk. Where is the tea that you drink?" Cook smiled. "I will have Amar bring you some in the dining room. Tuan will have eggs and toast for breakfast. I will prepare the same for you." Her eyes strayed to the rice pan. "Today, yes," I responded. "I don't want to steal someone else's dinner. But tomorrow, can you make more nasi goreng? Living in Australia, I've missed it." Cook nodded. Would you like Coco's eggs or English ones? She asked suddenly. Coco's. Yes, ma'am. She grinned. Eggs good for baby. A baby? If I bore William a child, I'd be free of my banishment, allowed to command my own destiny. Mother would leave me alone. And it meant more time in bed with William, attempting to fall pregnant. Give William an extra egg then. I nodded at the basket. He'll need his strength if he's to give me a child. Amma shot a questioning look at Cook, who translated my words into a language I didn't understand, but the other women did. Amma smiled broadly and nodded. Wonderful. We were all in agreement. If all I had to do to be a good wife was convince William that we should make love at every available moment, I could manage. After all, I'd managed to pass for human in Fremantle with no worries. But somehow, I suspected it wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. 3. I inhaled the steam from my third cup of floral-scented tea, recognizing the fragrance of jasmine from Mary's garden. This wasn't my preferred Japanese green tea, but it came in a close second as my favorite drink. Thank you, Amma. I opened my eyes to see William striding into the room. Amma scurried away with his coat and hat. William poured a cup of tea and added a liberal quantity of milk, before he sat in the cane chair beside me. Kiss me, Maria, or I'll swear you're still a ghost. I'd barely set my cup down before he enveloped me in his arms, starting a passionate kiss that I didn't want to end. He pulled me from my seat and I climbed willingly into his lap, our lips not parting for an instant. His hand slipped inside my dress and cupped my breast, making me want to take the damn dress off and everything else too, just to feel his skin against mine again. William, oh William. Abruptly, his hands weren't touching me anymore and he cleared his throat. To my surprise, he was blushing. What? Why did you stop? I demanded. It certainly wasn't because he didn't want me, I could feel his arousal under me. Thank you, Cook, he said, not even looking at me as she set his boiled eggs and toast on the table. The smell of spices and soy drew my attention to the other place setting, now occupied by a saucy-looking omelette that smelled divine. She smothered a smile and left, her shoulders shaking with laughter. William gave me a gentle push. We're the authority here. You need to behave properly. You can't just sit in my lap like one of the women from the White House. What will the servants think of you? I rose and smoothed my dress before settling into my own chair once more. They think I'm your newlywed wife, madly in love with you and eager to have a baby. Not as eager as those two are to see me pregnant, though. I nodded in the direction of the kitchen. When I tried to make my own breakfast earlier, your cook almost tried to drag me out of the kitchen. It's not like I was going to set the place on fire. I learned to cook a passable meal during my time in Fremantle. Though nothing as good as this. I cut a slice of my omelette and popped it into my mouth. Ooh, little prawns. She really did give me Coco's eggs. What in heaven's name are you eating? I laughed. Breakfast, William. The way they make eggs at Coco's. You can try some if you like. I held out my fork and he eyed it suspiciously. I trusted you enough to let you feed me chocolate. At least you know this is food. He relented and took a tiny bite. I watched the play of expressions across his face. First surprise, then deep concentration, followed by puzzlement before he finally swallowed. It's tolerable, I suppose. Stronger flavors than I'm used to. And the shrimp are such an odd combination with egg. Not something I'd customarily have for breakfast. He swallowed a mouthful of tea. Is this the sort of thing you ate for breakfast in Australia? No. Mary made this delicious mulberry jam and I'd make toast in the wood stove in the mornings, just so I could have some of her jam. I had the timing just right so that I could make my toast and eat it in the time it took for the kettle to boil for tea, before I went to work. I drifted into silence as I saw the hurt tightening William's eyes. I would have asked you to tea with me in Fremantle if you'd acknowledged me there. Instead, I had to follow you here. Maybe I could write her a letter and have the next carrier boat bring it to Fremantle for me. Perhaps she'd be willing to send us some jam as a wedding gift. She's the one who urged me to follow my heart, even if it meant traversing the whole ocean to find you. William opened his mouth to respond. He no longer had the hardness he'd armored himself in only moments before. This was the man I'd loved on the Travessa, who'd spilled his heart to me in the grotto. More tea, mem? I glanced up at Amma and nodded, watching her pour the jasmine tea into my cup before thanking her. No tin mugs here, I had a fine china cup and saucer, like Mary had used back in Fremantle. I lifted the cup to my lips and regarded William over the rim. In my moment of distraction, his armor had returned, more prickly and impenetrable than ever. Inwardly, I sighed. When Amma left, William seemed too intent on eating his own breakfast to talk about mine anymore. I laid a hand on his arm. William first lived as a respectable widow in Fremantle for 7 years. I know how a woman should behave in your world. But I was born in a remote colonial outpost much like this one, and you know that. In a population this small, those in authority set the tone for behavior. And I am no one's subordinate. Lass, this isn't the tiny community at Coco's, or even the rough town of Fremantle. Truth be told, it's a cut above what I was used to at home in Scotland too. We're the upper class here and we have to behave accordingly. It's as alien to anything you're used to as English was to you on the day we met. You're going to have to forget the life you knew and learn a whole new set of rules all over again. Think back to when we met. What happened to the frightened girl on the Travessa? I met his searching look squarely. She took a moment to shake herself and remember who she was and what she wanted. That was you, William. And she was willing to do whatever it took to win and keep you. Then and now. I knew I wanted you, and no shark or deranged madman or shipwreck would take you from me, not while either of us draws breath. I inhaled deeply, following his gaze to my swelling breast. I will do whatever I must to stay at your side here. To be a proper wife to you. How about you show me around the island a little today, while you're working? Something like the tour of the Travessa you took me on. And I'll show you I do know the proper behavior even for a place like this. And if you don't? William looked worried. I grinned. Well, I understand there's plenty of work at the White House for women who know how to please a man. I figure if I can please the man they call Grumpy McGregor, I shouldn't have much trouble at all. His jaw dropped and he looked horrified. So much for my attempt at humor. I'd sooner confine you to the house than that. If you can't carry yourself as an upper-class wife here on the island, I'll have to keep you here until the next ship docks, then send you back to Fremantle. Locked up and then banished, far from William? Not on my life. It's a madman indeed who tries to cage a dragon against her will, even if the dragon is his wife. I rose and touched my lips to his. Don't worry, William. I know to wear a hat and gloves in public. Not to mention shoes. I'll be the soul of propriety, I promise. And human, or as close as I could be. The way to be a good wife was not to be a dragon at all. 4. When I'd finished my breakfast, I excused myself to go find some shoes. After a quick glance in the mirror, I sighed and resigned myself to a slightly longer time getting ready. I pinned my hair up and secured my hat with no less than 4 hat pins. I grabbed my gloves and a pair of suitable shoes, biting my lip as I considered the stockings I'd avoided before breakfast. I rejected them again, clunking shut the lid of my trunk before I could change my mind. I stared at my reflection, knowing it would receive Mary's nod of approval if she could see me now. Me, a demure housewife who drank her tea out of a cup and saucer. Tea made for her by a servant, as though I lacked the ability to make my own breakfast. Perhaps this was something William couldn't do, First reflected. After all, I'd known him on a ship, where our meals were prepared by a cook and stewards. I'd rarely seen men preparing food in Fremantle, always it was the womenfolk who did it. Now he had me, I could change things. Cook and Amma could go and help some other deserving bachelor, leaving William and the kitchen to me. Perhaps he'd be more comfortable with only the two of us in the house, and he wouldn't reject me for fear of what other people might think. Was desiring one's wife a weakness? You look beautiful, William said over the clop of my shoes as I descended from the veranda. He gave a nod and an Indian man took off on his triumph, his tightly wound turban not budging at all as he opened up the throttle and accelerated. I reached William's side, noticing for the first time that what I'd thought were crab holes in the garden exhaled gusts of air that smelled of the salty sea below. No crab could do that. Not crab holes, sinkholes into the caves beneath the island. No wonder Dovorn's cave had been so well aerated, he'd undoubtedly had many air holes to the surface, hidden in the jungle. William offered me his arm and first took it, feeling the heat of him through his shirt sleeve and my white glove. Home. With him I felt like I was home. Not in the watery world at Coco's where I'd spent my childhood, but here. We strode down the road together, the mud fighting me every step as it sucked at my shoes or tried to help me slide a little faster down the incline to the cove. If it weren't for William's steadying arm anchored by his heavy boots, I'd have slid into Flying Fish Cove on my muddy backside, I was sure of it. But when we rounded the final bend, I stopped dead of my own accord. The cyclone I'd swum in so happily had destroyed the port. Hearing William's despairing description of the damage in the security of the grotto was nothing to seeing the devastation with my own eyes. The storage sheds beside the White House were smashed to kindling, flattened as though some huge creature had stepped on them and squashed them flat, while leaving the brothel intact. One of the piers was missing altogether, swept away by the storm swell that had raged where the calm waters rippled now. Not the triangular one where the islander had unloaded, but the short one beside it where I'd seen the phosphate ships loading. Was anyone hurt? I asked when I managed to find my voice. William's eyes held sympathy. No, by some miracle everyone was fine. Even when boulders came down the cliffs. He pointed at the inland cliff where brown cascades of mud and rock had tumbled down the 100-foot precipice, turning it into an incline of sorts, though an impossibly steep one. I drew in a sharp breath. Landslides. I knew he'd mentioned them, but never had I expected they'd be so big. Some of the rocks sticking out of the mud looked bigger than Tony's truck, and when I imagined the speed at which they'd hurtled down the cliffs to the land below, William was right. It was one of Mary's miracles that no one had been hurt. William headed unerringly for a 2-story building that seemed to have taken very little damage at all, as it towered over the wrecked storage sheds. I climbed the stairs and froze when I reached the top and saw past the wrecked port to what had been the group of workers' houses known collectively as the kampung, the Malay word for village. The pier wasn't missing at all, the swell had strewn it along the beach, smashing it against palm trees and leaving bits on the eroded bank that had once been the kampung road. No more, the waves had washed away the road and the foundations beneath the rail line. From the debris washed up on the kampung verandas, it looked like the waves had licked the houses themselves. Between the landslide behind and the swell pounding their front doors, it seemed the ocean had truly tried to swallow the kampung. I glanced at William, whose expression had hardened at the sight of the cove. He'd said it was his curse that had caused the damage. As if one man could call a cyclone. Not even one of the ocean's gift could call down a storm of this magnitude. Though if I'd been so inclined, I could have worked with the waves to destroy the other piers. Think human, not mermaid. I shook myself and said softly, it's not your fault, you know. The ocean doesn't curse people. It was just a storm. A bad one, but nothing out of the ordinary for this part of the world. It was the worst storm on record at Christmas Island. How is that ordinary? William snapped. I wondered what sort of storms my grandfather had experienced here, and how humans had survived on the surface then. How long have humans been living on the island? I asked absently, then held my breath as I realized what I'd said. I should have said people, not humans. William didn't seem to notice my slip. 40 years, give or take a few. The worst storm in 40 years. The worst storm to reach a tiny rock in a huge ocean in only 40 years? And no one died? William, that's no curse, that's good fortune. I grew up at Coco's, and it's a far different story there. We saw storms like this every summer, and sometimes more than once. I remember when I was a little girl, one cyclone leveled every building on Home Island. There were so many palm trees floating in the lagoon along with planks from the houses, they could have made a raft big enough for the entire Coco's population. The raft William had found me floating on had been constructed from washed-up cyclone wreckage. I'd watch the children lash it together and take it on short voyages between islands, before I'd stolen it in a fit of fury at my mother, my people, and anyone else who was allowed to remain at Coco's when I was cast out. William's voice cut through my bitter thoughts. That must have been terrible for you. How did you survive, lass? On the raft, I'd survived on sheer fury alone until I'd succumbed to despair at my exile and the loss of all those I'd known and loved. When the Travessa had spotted me, it had been days since I'd last been able to force myself to sing up a meal. But William wasn't talking about my banishment. What was his sympathy for? The cyclone? I'd been all of 3 years old and my sister had taken me into deep water to tumble in the swell, giggling together as we let the power of it carry us home. Duyong had taught me to ride the waves better than even dolphins could. Until Mother had found out and scolded us both. More painful memories, and William was still waiting for a response. I shrugged. I was very small. I only remember that the houses were gone, and it seemed all the fish in the ocean wanted to hide under the floating wreckage. There was food aplenty for weeks. His expression seemed to hold awe. It's a wonder you're still alive, given all you've been through. You're a survivor, that's for sure. I only wish I had your courage. He stared out to sea, blinking furiously. What? William had courage in spades. He'd waded fearlessly into fights without showing anything but his certainty of a successful outcome. I'm stubborn, not brave, William. It took a lot of courage to try to come after me in shark-infested waters when the Travessa sank. If only I'd had your stubbornness then, I might have done more than try, William said darkly, then cleared his throat. Come on, let's choose the film for tonight's cinema showing. Your choice, if you'll come to the cinema with me. They had a cinema on this tiny island. Of course. I used to go to the cinema in Fremantle with Mary or Tony. Well, I only went once with Tony. He took me to see this film about monsters that drank blood. Dracula, I think it was called. You wouldn't call me brave if you'd seen me then. It was a dark night with no moon and the cinema's outdoors, so you hear all sorts of noises and then a frightening film to boot. That was the last time I went to the cinema with him. William's eyes blazed as he grasped my wrist. Who is Tony? I didn't understand his anger. The man I worked for in the fish markets. Tony Basile. At his start of recognition, I remembered when they'd met. The man in the cross-country motorcycle race who took a tumble in the river with you on the last lap. That idiot? You walked out with that idiot? It seemed I'd only thrown fuel on the fire of his fury. He cut me off in the race and I'd have damn near killed him if I hadn't swerved and gone into the river instead. Damn near lost my motorcycle too. Now I want to kill him more than ever for even thinking he had a chance with you, lass. My God. My temper flared up. Tony was my employer and my friend, William. Yes, he wanted to be more. I was lonely and I enjoyed his company, and while you were busy ignoring me all over Fremantle, he asked me to marry him. But I wanted you to be my wife. What did you say to him? William demanded. I yanked my arm from his grasp. You never asked me. Not once. You spoke of what you wanted on the ship, but you never asked me. The anguish in his eyes broke my heart. But you didn't understand. You didn't speak English. How could I have asked you to marry me when you didn't know what I was asking you to do? I consider myself an honorable man. I couldn't coerce you into a marriage you might not want. He swallowed. Maria, what did you tell him? When he asked you, what was your answer? I didn't answer him. I bade him good night and that's all. The following day I boarded the Islander in Fremantle and you know the rest. His eyebrows scrunched together as his face grew as thunderous as the sky last week. I'm beginning to think there's a lot I don't know, and I aim to find out. Now you're my wife, there should be no secrets between us and... A grinning Chinese man burst through the door and out onto the veranda. Tuan. The Islander brought Frankenstein's monster. He triumphantly held up a film reel. This isn't even in Singapore yet. Can we show this at tonight's cinema? William made a vague, affirmative reply that made the man grin more widely than ever. Will you come to the cinema to watch the scary monster movie, Mem? The man asked politely. You are Tuan's sister, yes? William coughed. This is my wife, Mrs. McGregor. My sister, Mrs. White, is still in Scotland as far as I know, though she keeps writing and telling me how much she'd like to visit. His sister? The woman he talked about on the ship? The true owner of my precious tortoiseshell comb. William nudged me and first realized the Chinese man was looking at me expectantly. Awkwardly I apologized and asked him to repeat his question. No question, ma'am. I only said I was honored to meet you and I hope you enjoy your stay on Christmas Island. A pleasure, mister. I realized that neither he nor William had told me the man's name. He flashed another grin. Ong mem. If your husband had warned us of your arrival, we'd have planned a banquet in your honor. I managed an answering smile. A pleasure, Mr. Ong. A glance at William's scowl stopped me from saying more as he seized my arm and hustled me back down the stairs.